Welcome, listeners, to Artist Tales, the podcast that features and celebrates artists from different walks of life. I'm your host, Heather Martin, and in this episode, I'm chatting with Emma Goulding, who's a photographer, writer, and artist in the northwest of England. Welcome, Emma.
Hello, thank you.
So tell me a little bit about yourself and your art and how you got started.
So, a little bit about me. I am a mother, a wife, and a scientist in my day-to-day life ordinarily. I'm sure we'll come back to that at some point. I came to creativity rather late in life, 2020, pandemic year. Although it was slightly before the pandemic that I started with photography. And as I progressed with my photography, I found that photography was a way for me to both connect with my thoughts and connect with others, which I'd never really thought I could do before. I didn't think anyone was interested in anything I had to say. And as I started sharing my photography on Instagram and sort of formed a community around that, or rather joined other communities that already existed, I found that people were actually interested in what I had to say. And the more that I realised that, the more I realised that I actually had to say. So I started out writing short captions, which gradually got longer and longer. And then I decided that probably I needed somewhere where I could do long form writing. So I now have my website, which I launched back in December, with a blog section and another section for my photography. My writing and my photography are my main artistic outlets. I'd say they're the only ones that I feel that I've got any level of skill in, but I don't feel like you have to be excellent at art to consider yourself an artist. I think if you want to monetize it, then you probably need to be pretty good at your art, but otherwise it's just great to be able to get your feelings out some way and connect to other people in some way. So yeah, my photography and writing are the areas where I feel more confident, but there are other areas that I've sort of started tentatively dipping my toes into and may or may not do some more of those.
Tell me a bit more of the other areas you're exploring.
So I'm quite interested in filmmaking, but I haven't actually started learning how to do that properly at all. So the most I've done is like little videos on my phone, and I've done a couple on my camera, but there's nothing very big. I say filmmaking, that's probably overstating it. I just mean like short video clips, more like sound of motion rather than just static photography. I'm quite interested in dance. I'm not in any way a trained dancer. I always wanted to be as a child, but I had several hobbies and there wasn't time for dance as well. I did a little at A level, not an entire dance A level. I did performing arts, and dance wasn't the area that I was, should we say, most talented in, but I do enjoy dancing. I enjoy moving my body to music and just sort of letting go. And people have said that there's a sort of dance element to my self-portraiture, which hasn't really been intentional, but I can see how that's filtered in because it is something that I really enjoy. In my throughout my 20s, I did a lot of clubbing, going out to nightclubs and just dancing and dancing for hours and hours. And it was where I felt really free. And again, where I felt a real sense of community, which sounds a bit odd, but the kind of clubs that I used to go to, you would see people that would go to all the different events and you'd get to know people. And we'd all we'd make these elaborate costumes. And yeah, so I've gone off on a tangent, which is what I have a tendency to do. So yeah, dance, video, what else? I'm very, very slightly dipping my toes into drawing, but no one's ever going to see that because it's definitely not an area where I have skill. And yeah, I think that's probably it for now, but who knows what will take my fancy down the line.
It sounds like you're quite a well-rounded artist in many ways, and even if some of them, you put more time, I don't want to say put more time or effort, but you publicize a bit more than others. It sounds like you're well-rounded or trying to explore that side of yourself.
I've never really thought of it until I started talking about it then as a branch of my art, because it's just things that I do because I'm interested in them. But more recently, when I've been thinking about ways that I can experiment, in fact, I think possibly that I do a lot of things that I don't consider worthy of consideration, if that makes sense. So up until recently, I wouldn't have classed myself as a writer because I thought I was just, I'm just writing little snippets. No one's interested in it. And I recently did some coaching where it was brought to my attention that a lot of the things that I was putting a lot of time and effort and thought and emotion into, I wasn't giving myself any credit for. And I was kind of dismissing. And that, to a degree, included my photography, but not as much, but mostly my writing. And I think recently I've started to realize that these are the little snippets of things that I have been doing probably deserve a bit more recognition from me, if not from anybody else. That's why I'm sort of trying to encompass them within my art now. But I haven't really gone with it, sort of gone out with intention and said, I'm going to make this short film about such and such. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, it's more about capturing a moment, which is very much what my photography has been about. But sometimes that moment just feels more like it would be captured better fluidly.
And what are people's reactions to both your photography and the writing?
They've been really lovely and quite humbling. They've been a surprise to me because, as I said, I didn't really think anyone had any interest in anything I had to say. And in fact, so I've done a couple of these podcasts, and the first one I did, my kids just went, who'd want to hear you talk? In the way that only preteen children can. And that's kind of just what I'd always thought. But so when I first started sharing photographs on Instagram, and that's kind of the only place apart from my website where I do share them, it was just the stuff that I was learning as I went along. So I shared pictures of all sorts. But then as the pandemic struck, it was around about the time that I started getting really into portraiture. And suddenly I was very restricted in who I could take portraits of, which is why I ended up going down the self-portraits route. My children very quickly got sick of being my models. So that's why I went into self-portraits. And through that is where I found my voice with the writing, really, because, and to a degree, I think the photographs can speak for themselves. But what I found was that sometimes people would interpret them through their own lens, which again is something that's always going to happen. Once you put your art out there, it's open to the interpretation of the audience. But I was in a place, so sort of from June 2020, where the Black Lives Matter started coming to the fore again, was very much in a place where I was trying to get across specific things about my experience as a Black woman. And sometimes people would see that, and sometimes people would sort of try and turn that around and match it to their experience in another way, which is fine because it's nice that people are able to connect with it in that way. But I also very specifically wanted to get my point across about, and I have got a post somewhere on that on Instagram. Yes, I want to recognise the ways in which our lives are similar, but I also want you to recognise the ways that our lives are different and why that is. And the reason that I did that is not one reason, it's a variety of reasons. But around about the same time, I was still pretty active on Facebook. I don't really use it anymore. And I had made a series of posts detailing things that had happened to me as a Black person that I don't think, well, I know for a fact that wouldn't have happened to a white person. Just to, because most of my friends and the people that I know in real life are white because I live in a suburban area in Manchester that's mostly white. And I grew up in a similar area. So most of those people have had a different life experience to me. And so I made these posts to try and point out the way that, not necessarily where anyone has done, well, no, that where people had done specific things that had impacted me the way they wouldn't have impacted somebody who was white, and explaining sort of what happened and why it impacted me in the way that it did. And the feedback that I got from those 3 posts, again, was overwhelmingly people saying, wow, I had no idea. Wow, thank you for sharing. Can I share this post on my page? Will you make it public? So at that point, I realized that I had something to say that people weren't hearing from elsewhere and maybe needed to hear. But also, lots of people were coming forward at that point to say similar things. So the way that I was back then, I would possibly have gone back into my shell and said, well, in fact, I had done that previously. So I'd been talking about race on my Facebook for about 10 years and got very little traction or interest in any of it. And at one point I had a bit of a rant and said that, you're all complicit, because if I share anything about issues that might affect you, so LGBTQ issues, learning difficulties, disabilities, anything where it felt like people could see it and think, well, that could be me, or that could be my child in the future, got traction. And anything that was to do with race, because it was in their eyes never going to affect them, didn't get any traction. And so I got quite angry at that point, and wouldn't say I lashed out, but I basically said, by not sharing this information that I'm giving to you that's not getting any publicity in the mainstream news, you're complicit because people aren't finding out about it. And the landscape was very different back then. And I was met with a wall of fragility, and basically people saying, how dare you accuse us of being racist? You can't say these kind of things. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And because of the situation that I find myself in, or most of my friends are white, most of my neighbours are white, I very quickly got back in my box and was like, oh, right, fine. I don't have any allies here. And it was very isolating, and I felt very lonely, because I felt like a lot of the people that either A, hadn't said anything, or B, had reacted with fragility, I didn't feel safe around those people fully anymore to be myself. But it just carried on, as you do. And then when in 2020, when it was more in sort of the public psyche and people were learning the lingo and starting to understand what fragility meant, and start to understand, that the concept of white supremacy didn't necessarily mean all white people are bad, or that all white people are racist. And actually, the first incidents that I spoke about where I said I got back in my box were around about the time, I don't know if you know about, when Monroe Bergdorf had come out and said something along the lines of, all white people are racist. And she got ditched from the L'Oreal campaign. And everyone was up in arms. How dare she say such a thing? What she'd actually, and she did use those words, but what I understood, and what a lot of people that were involved in that kind of activism realised, was what she meant was that everybody has implicit, probably unconscious, but sometimes not, biases about race, but that there was no sort of nuance around it. And much in the way that L'Oreal came running back to Monroe in 2020, everyone was suddenly going, oh, wow, we shouldn't have reacted in that way when you said those things. So it kind of felt a little bit like vindication, but it also felt like, and I did get quite angry about it sometimes. I was like, but if you'd listened like this 10 years ago, we wouldn't be in this place now. George Floyd didn't have to die. All these other people didn't have to die. If everyone had just listened 10 years ago, when we were saying these things, when Mike Brown was killed, when Trayvon Martin was killed, but now all of a sudden everyone wants to get on board. Well, that's great, but you need to catch up. So there were a lot of people talking about race around that time, and there were a lot of people doing it with a lot more knowledge and confidence and all kinds of things than me. I'm not a race scholar. I'm just someone talking about my lived experience, and I've always been very honest and clear about that. I'm not here to be a race activist, but that's kind of what happens by default when you talk about your experiences that include anything to do with race. And the fact that there were people out there doing it with more knowledge and experience and background than me, again, kind of would have made me sort of go, oh, well, I'll just point you in the direction of these people. But what I had realised around about then, and also maybe in the year preceding that, was that personal stories have much more of an effect on people at the individual level than big sort of news stories or events or things like that. So yeah, George Floyd dying was horrendous and it drew everyone's attention to it. But I think a lot of people would probably have just turned around and gone, well, I'm not that kind of racist, until you sort of tell your stories about what the little things that they may have contributed to on a day-to-day basis without even realising it, how that is all part of the bigger picture. So can't tell you, to be honest, why I decided that I had to carry on telling my story, but I just saw that there was a window for making a difference through telling my story. And again, I had noticed that previously. So I don't know if you're familiar with the podcast, The Guilty Feminist.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really good. But on one of those episodes, they had been talking about the power of stories in getting people to, personal stories, in getting people to vote in the Section 28 referendum in Northern Ireland, and getting people to vote in favour of gay marriages. It had been not the big campaigns that had made the difference, but people having conversations at the personal level that had made certain people change their mind from one side of the debate to the other. So that was another reason that I thought it was important. So now I know that I have ADHD, it makes sense why my mind's always been pinging around like this. But for that year before I took up photography, my mind was pinging around of how do I tell these stories? And I had an idea of a podcast, and I had an idea of something else, and all these different ideas, but I have the ideas and I don't get any of them off the ground. So the fact that it happened quite organically through my photography and sort of just stuff that I guess you'd call writing now, but it was just a post I put on Facebook, led me to the right place, I suppose.
It sounds like photography, and the writing gave you an outlet for that voice, because I agree with you that it is the stories. I think humans like stories, well before writing and everything else. How we learned and how we connected is through stories. And it sounds like, certainly with the photography and the writing, it was an outlet for you to share your story and for people to interact and engage with it.
Yeah. And it was a much less vulnerable way of doing it than sort of having the conversations with people directly. So, because I have spoken to people directly about things that they've done that have been potentially racially insensitive in the past, but it's always felt massively vulnerable because, like I say, if you're in a group of people and you challenge one of them on something that they've done and everybody else is affected to go, oh my goodness, how could you accuse such and such of being racist? Then you very quickly risk alienating yourself from all of your social situations. So, I mean, I still do that occasionally with people that I feel safe with, but putting these things on my Instagram where people could see them felt like a way of getting that information out there, but without having to directly challenge anybody. And like I say, sometimes I will challenge people directly. It will depend on the situation and whether I feel like I have allies around me. And it's much easier now that the landscape has shifted because people know that it's not okay to say certain things. And even the people that don't know it's okay, there's normally more people on the right side of the fence, as I like to call it, than the wrong side. So if you challenge someone on something, someone's normally got your back. Whereas pre-2020, I feel largely like that wasn't necessarily the case.
It feels like BLM protests and then, the sad events of, George Floyd dying was a bit of a catalyst for a lot of things in those conversations to happen. Because as you're talking, the one thing that I'm very conscious of, and it has been even a journey for me, is being a white English-speaking Canadian. I'm perceived in a certain way. I'm seen as an expat. If I were black or brown or, Asian, it'd be kind of like, oh, you're not quite one of us. And I've become more and more aware of it, and it's actually quite painful, because it's actually, well, I'm not born here, and yet I'm not. I remember years ago saying, well, I'm an immigrant, and people say, oh, no. Even now, it's kind of like challenge people saying, you're an expat. No, actually. And it's like, no, you're not. And from white people. And it's uncomfortable because we're all people,
Yeah, it's that distinction, isn't there?
Yeah.
Between an immigrant and an expat, like all the Brits in Spain, they're all expats, but you're immigrants. It's the same thing. It's just like reasoning, but immigrant is a label that gets given to people with a different skin color, and people with the same skin color as the dominant population are an expat.
Exactly.
It's, yeah.
So it sounds like that has really influenced your work and your art. Now, you did mention your ADHD, and I was just wondering if you would like to talk about that in terms of how it influences you with your art.
So I don't write about race all of the time on my Instagram, and I did do a post about this. I write about my life experiences. Sometimes that involves race, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, as I move through the world, I'm obviously always perceived as a black woman before anything else because that's what people see when they see me. Well, I think some people might think that I'm a man because I've got very short hair now. So that influenced a lot of my work in 2020 because race was at the forefront of everything. And occasionally now something will happen or come up in the media and race will become an issue again and I will interact with it in that way. But I don't talk about it all the time. Or if something happens in my everyday life, I'll mention it. But in October, I suppose I should also say that all along throughout, I'm very open about speaking about my mental health difficulties. I always have been. People call me, think I'm a miserable so-and-so because I just wear my heart on my sleeve and I tell it how it is. And I'm not miserable. I have a lot of fun. I have a lot of laughs, but I also don't lie about the bad stuff either. So if I'm having a rotten time, everyone knows I'm having a rotten time. And if I'm feeling a bit down, I don't try and cover it up because I want other people to feel like I'm someone they can turn to if they're having a rubbish time, not one of these people who's living this perfect life out here and they need to feel less than because they're not living that perfect life. And that's how my social media, so my Instagram now and my Facebook previously was always like that. And I get people going, "Oh, Emma, do you ever have anything good to say? Oh, Emma, you always," and I'm like, yeah, but you're only paying attention to the ones where I'm moaning. I share lots of pictures of me out having fun with my friends, but I'm not like you, just posting pictures of me having fun with my friends or my perfect family. I'm telling the truth about what it's actually like so that other people don't have to feel like they're not living this perfect life, because nobody is, are we? So it's always been very important to me to be honest about life on my social media. And obviously, because I'm writing from a very personal place on my Instagram, it doesn't make sense for me to be anything else. And I also feel very strongly that by being your honest self in these spaces is how you find your people. And that's very much proven to be true for me up till now. So 2020 was hard for all of us, everybody, and 2021 wasn't much better. Around about April 2021, I started to feel like I was spiraling downwards very, very quickly. And I've looked back at my Instagram because it is like my visual journal, and I can see that actually things started declining much earlier than that. But that's when it felt like it suddenly went really hard. And I kind of just dragged myself through for months and months, having conversations with people in private. I was quite honest on my Instagram when I was having a bad day or having a bad time and what I was trying to do to combat that. But yeah, having conversations with people in private saying I really could probably do with getting some therapy because I know I've got a lot of issues to sort out, but I just don't feel like I've got the headspace because I'm working, I've got the kids, I'm trying to keep up with my creative outlets, I'm going to the gym. So I just kept on trying to do everything because I've done some like counselling before, and I know that, you know, for hours afterwards you can be wiped out and you need time to process it and you need time to think things through. So I just didn't feel like I had the time, so I just kept putting it off. I said to a friend, I said, I feel like I could just do with, you know, like stars from the 90s and 2000s where they just go off to rehab for a month. I feel like I could just do with that. I'm not addicted to drugs or anything. I just need some peace and quiet. I've got exhaustion. And then, yeah, I was just getting more and more tired and my mood was very up and down. So I was still very happy at times. I was going out, I was actively seeking joy. I was part of a class called Now, and we do things like that. So I'd go out and I'd take self-portraits and I'd make sure I got my fresh air. But whenever I filled my cup up at the weekends, I felt like it would only ever get to 70, 80% full. And then by Tuesday, I would be down at nearly empty and I'd have to limp through the rest of the week and then get back to the weekend and fill it up. And I was spending every day that I wasn't working a full day at work, every day that I could, I needed to take a nap. I wasn't always sleeping when I tried to take a nap because my mind was racing all the time. I wasn't sleeping at night very well. I was just exhausted all the time. And it was around about the time. So I was doing a course called Naked Marketing, which is about selling art. Ironically, at that point, I didn't really feel like I had anything to sell when it started. But it was a 6-month course and it was incredibly immersive. And it was such a supportive community and everyone was very open and honest and vulnerable. And it was very nourishing. And I felt like I could truly open up and be honest in that space, which kind of filtered out into the real world. And I found myself having some very open and honest and vulnerable conversations with some people who I didn't really know that well at the time, but who are now very dear friends of mine. And sort of all this sort of fits together in that towards the end of Naked Marketing, I was getting ready to create my website. That was what I was going to get out of the other end of it. And it was just before then, I was having a chat with my friend James, who was helping me build my website. But I had sent him about 6,000, not 6,000, but quite a lot of messages in the time before we had a chat. Loads of questions, loads of things that I wanted to know, things that I wanted to do. And he just basically said, we sat down to have this chat about my website and he just went, I think you need to get yourself assessed for ADHD. And I sort of went, oh, well, you might not be the first person to have had that thought. And we skimmed over it and we carried on and we got my website like set up. And I went away and I listened to, well, basically, as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Because he was diagnosed the year before. So that's why he recognised it. But my friend Jo, who happens to be James's wife, had also sort of dropped a couple of hints where she sort of was trying to very gently I think, guide me towards thinking that maybe I might have ADHD. James isn't so subtle. So he just landed me with it. And yeah, I listened to, there's a magazine. It's called, we hate saying it because it sounds so like American and slightly lame, but it's called Attitude. It's ADD, Attitude magazine. And they do like an experts podcast. And I listened to one about ADHD being diagnosed in women in later life. And it was like listening to a description of my life, and I had to stop it halfway through because I was crying so much. And I just messaged Joe and I said, I think James is right. I don't know what to do next. And I had already been having conversations with my boss at work saying, I do feel very close to some kind of burnout. I don't think I can carry on like this. I'm doing what I can, but things don't feel right. So I think you should get assessed for ADHD was kind of the final straw. And I managed to make it through another day at work, and then I went into my boss and I just said, I can't do this. I need to know what's going on. I need to get this sorted out, and I need to take some time. So she said, just go. You can self-certify for a week. If you need to call your doctor and get a longer sick note, do that. I haven't been back to work since. That was in October. But yeah, she was really helpful because her daughter had been recently diagnosed with autism and was going back through the system because they won't assess for both at the same time for ADHD. So she gave me loads of advice, loads of people to follow on social media, loads of websites to look at. And she basically said, it's going to be a long slog. If you want to get assessed through the NHS, you're going to have to fight for it every step of the way. And I walked out of her office and I was just like, I haven't got any fight in me. I was absolutely exhausted. So I spoke to Joe and James because I knew that James had his assessment privately. So that's what I did. I went online and I booked the appointment quite quickly for me because normally that's the kind of thing I'd procrastinate over. So I was trying to figure out the best person to go with. And I rang the doctors and I asked them to sign me off. And she said, yeah, I'll sign you off for 2 weeks. Go out and do the things that bring you joy, because I don't think you're depressed because things are still making you happy, but you're obviously struggling. So just spend 2 weeks resting and doing things that make you happy. And I was convinced that I would have those 2 weeks off. It would get me to the assessment. I might need another week after that just to, process it. And then I'd be back at work. But what actually happened was I spent 2 weeks chasing joy and my sleep improved and I felt much better until the day before the assessment. And then I had the assessment and got diagnosed. And that was great. People say, oh, I'm sorry, but it was actually probably one of the best days of my life because I felt a huge sense of affirmation and vindication and forgiveness to myself for all of the things that I'd spent my entire life believing were just character flaws or things that were wrong with me. Having the diagnosis meant that there was a reason for it all. I wasn't just rubbish. I was just different. And it meant that there was a way, A, there was going to be medication, so I would not be exhausted all the time. And B, there would be ways to manage my mind. Now I understood it better. So the diagnosis was great, but actually I did the forgiveness part as soon as I had the realization the 2 weeks before. And just before the assessment, I did what apparently now everybody does, which is go, oh my God, I'm not going to get diagnosed and I've just made it all up. And then afterwards, the same thing that everybody does, which is, well, maybe I just pretended so well that they think I've got ADHD, but I don't really have ADHD. But no, there was a point where I just knew. And if the psychiatrist had said any different, I would have just thought, well, okay, that's what you think, but this is what I know. So yes, I've gone off a massive tangent, but so yeah, my diagnosis has been great. And the ADHD, the knowledge that I have ADHD has filtered into my art and my writing in the same way that every other life experience does. But I feel like it's deepened my creative practice because it's deepened my awareness and my knowledge of myself. So all of the work that I did previous to that in 2020 and 2021 was learning more about myself and my place in the world as I spoke about it. So as I took these photos and wrote the captions as they were at that point, I was starting to know myself better through them. And that's why I kept going with it. Naked marketing took that to another level because we were encouraged to look even deeper within ourselves and be open and honest and vulnerable with other people, which just makes for a wonderful place of self-knowledge. And without that, I wouldn't have felt safe enough to unmask as far as I did in front of my new friends, and they would never have noticed my ADHD because I keep a very firm mask on in front of most people. And, the people that have known me for years would never have noticed it. Some of them just because they wouldn't have recognized the signs. But if I had carried on putting on my public face in front of these people, they would never have spotted it either. And I think, to be fair, we had been close for the whole of the naked marketing time. And it was only in October where it became starkly obvious, because I said to them, feels like now I know that every interaction we've ever had has been obvious that I've got ADHD. So how long have you guys known? And everybody's like, oh no, it literally just was like, oh yeah, she's got ADHD. Not like we've been thinking about it for months. I was like, oh, but I think that space to be open and honest is what allowed me to reveal the ADHD traits to the extent that they could spot them. And now I feel that I have been able to do that and be accepted and still loved for who I am without my mask on. It makes me feel more confident in revealing parts of what's beyond the mask in other areas, particularly through my art. So I have been talking a lot about the process, the realization, the diagnosis, the assessment, and basically the feelings and things that have arisen throughout the time since then on my Instagram and on my website. I do more on my website now because I do feel like I'm being censored a lot by Instagram and it fills me with rage. So I try and keep most of my most vulnerable writing from my website. But I do still think it's important to share on Instagram because that's where more people are likely to see it and where it can help more people. And through that, again, I've met a load more people who are in a similar situation, who have been diagnosed in adulthood, didn't know anyone else who had ADHD, and just been able to have some really open and honest and really interesting conversations with people. And what happened in 2020 with the race uprisings was that I found a community of other Black people who had grown up in heavily white areas and didn't have another Black friend. And we found community online, and that's sort of happened all over again with the ADHD. I found another community of people, and that wouldn't have happened. Like I said, if you're not honest about who you are in these spaces, your people can't find you. And so if I hadn't spoken about, talked about, photographed my feelings and what happened around the ADHD, I wouldn't have made these new connections either. So there's nothing that's a lie. I don't think my ADHD diagnosis has brought anything negative with it so far. The only thing that I would count as a slight downside, and it's not because of the ADHD, is the fact that I've been unable to return to work. And I say that that's not because of the ADHD, it kind of is, but I've always had ADHD and I've done the job for nearly 20 years with a little gap. So I can do my job with ADHD. It was the burnout that caused me to need to be off work for so long. So after I had the realization and then I had the assessment and got diagnosed, I properly burned out. Like trying to process that new information, I said that I thought I would maybe need a week to process it and then I could go back to work. I had massively underestimated how much there was to process from that. So in terms of all the things there were to learn about ADHD, which I obviously haven't learned all of them, finding out so many things about myself that I thought were just me, but are actually ADHD, grief for all of the times in the past when it's obvious to me now looking back that ADHD was the cause of the problems that I was having. And I don't blame anybody because it's only very recently that it's been recognised that it presents differently in women and hormones can affect it and all these other things. So I don't blame anybody for not having spotted it sooner, but that doesn't stop there from being a massive sense of grief and loss for all the missed opportunities for life to have been so much easier for me. And to have been able to explain to people, well, yes, I'm doing this in this way, which doesn't make any sense to you, but there's a reason for that. Whereas I've spent, and I'm 42 now, I was 41 when I was diagnosed, almost my entire adult life just thinking, I'm really crap at adulting. And, there's been plenty of things that have reinforced that down the line. And it was just overwhelming trying to process that and still look after the kids. And it was just too much. So I've been off work ever since.
In all honesty, I think you've done amazing, with all the things you're having to, work with, or I don't really want to say deal with, but, the challenges that you have. And we all have challenges, and adulting is, I think, hard for everyone, but particularly if you have something like ADHD or whatever, it can present, other challenges as well.
Yeah.
Now, for the last question, what's next for your art? Where do you see it going, or do you know?
What is next? So I've been talking about not being at work. And in fact, that is a way that the ADHD, the burnout has kind of benefited my art, because I've found myself with so much more time to create. And obviously I've got a lot to process. So there's a lot of emotion coming out in my art. I feel like the photography that I've produced recently and the writing that I've done is the best that I've ever done. Unfortunately, Instagram deems it unfit to be seen by anybody, which is kind of frustrating. But I think it's had a positive impact on my art because of that greater sense of knowing that I described before. So I'm going back to work in the week after next. So I'm looking now to finding a balance so that I can still continue to create, because I'm still processing, I'm still learning, I'm still trying to understand. And it's going to take time, and I need time and space to do that. But I do also need some semblance of my old routine back. So I do need to get back to work, and I'm looking forward to it. But I'm also very keenly keeping my eyes open for where that balance starts to tip. I need to make sure that I still have time to create and the space to process things. So I have spoken to my boss about reducing my hours, and to make that financially viable, I do need to start monetizing in some way my art. I don't have a full idea of what that looks like at this point. I would like to start offering photography sessions to people. I like doing family shoots. I like shooting pictures of artists at work. I recently photographed a life drawing workshop the other week, which I loved. And I've been speaking with the people who run the space about potentially doing some more stuff with them. That's just on a voluntary basis. But I want to do more to lift up other marginalized communities as well. So I need to finance it somehow. I've got various ideas about that, how that might work, because obviously I don't want to be necessarily making money by taking photographs of people who are more marginalized. I would like to do something else which finances me to have the time to do that, as well as having the time to process my own things. So still very much in a process of figuring all of that out at the moment. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure what that looks like. But I'm hoping to start a newsletter soon from my website. And that again is to do with the frustrations around Instagram. I feel like I would like to have a more secure community outside of that space. Much as I love it, and much as I've found so many different communities on there that resonate with me, it just doesn't feel like a stable place to house all of that. So looking into other ways of creating that outside of that space. And yeah, see where it takes me, basically. So what I've done all along, I've just been riding the waves of it so far. So that's what I intend to carry on doing. Follow the dopamine.
Great. Well, thanks. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you. It's been lovely to chat to you too.
Thanks for listening to this episode with Emma. I hope you enjoyed it. More information about Emma, as well as the podcast, can be found in the episode notes. If you're able to, please rate and review the podcast in the podcast apps. In the next episode, I speak with Lottie Little, who's a painter and maker based in London, England. Here's a clip of our conversation.
I think that my life has been centered around creating things, creating people, but particularly creating things in various different ways. And I've come to see, at first I thought maybe I was just a dilettante. And I've come to see that actually I think it's part of a life view of how you manage things. That if you're like me, that everything you do is a creative act. And some are more successful than others, and some have more point maybe than others. But I can't separate what I am from what I do.
I look forward to you joining me in the next episode with Lottie.